Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Lee Duncan, and I am absolutely delighted to welcome you to the first in a series of 3 security webinars. Given the activity we're seeing in the US around ATM attacks, we thought it would be a really good opportunity just to gather and talk about some of the risks and some of the solutions around all areas of the ATM security. I'm actually joined today by Derek Henderson and Aldrin Barreto, and we're actually going to dive into everything around logical security. Before I hand you over to Derek, can I just remind you that we're going to use the chat function. Just use that, please, to ask any questions of our solution matter experts. The material is intended to last around about 45 minutes, but we'll absolutely make sure we've got time to answer your questions at the end. We're recording the session, so anyone that has accepted the meeting request and they weren't able to join, they can actually download that and listen back, because we will make it available to you right after the call. But for now, I'll hand you over to Derek and we can get started. Thank you, everyone. Derek?
Thank you, Lee. And our pleasure to have the chance to talk to everybody today. As Lee said, this is the first in our series. So what we want to concentrate on today is to talk about logical ATM security, something which has been in the news quite a bit because of the various different attacks which have taken place. And unfortunately, in some instances, that has led to some a result of what we call jackpotting on some ATMs which have been out there. So what we want to cover today is we want to talk a little bit about recent ATM attack trends, what we've seen, some of the different attacks which we've seen. A reminder for everybody who's on the call who may not have seen it about what we see as the different logical attack vectors, how to guard against those different types of logical attacks, and what we look upon as our recommendations, which are available through our NCR Atlays website. A little bit of a touch into how we're taking our solutions forward with one of our newer solutions in the security management area. Close off with a few final thoughts, and then we'll give everybody the opportunity to put some questions in through the chat, as Lee has said. So hopefully everybody will find this insightful and useful, and I would encourage you to put your questions in through the chat, and we will get through as many as we can. So the first thing that I wanted to come to is actually a definition. When we talk about logical attacks, or when we talk about logical crime, just what do we mean? So I pulled this definition out of a paper which is done by the Europol, was a police organization, out of their document on guidance and recommendations on logical attacks. And they define it as, as you can see, there are a set of malicious actions performed in order to be able to get access to systems or components for the purpose of obtaining cash. And they specifically talk about malware as a part of that attack vector. Another way to look upon it is a logical attack is an attack where there's an exploitation of software or of digital interfaces of some kind on an ATM or an ATM systems, rather than physical tampering. So that's perhaps another way of looking at it. So when we're talking about logical attacks and everything around it, that's what we're meaning, rather than something physical. We'll get onto some of the different aspects of that as we go through the webinar series. So I just wanted to put that in there as a level set of what we mean. The other thing that I wanted to mention is that the term jackpotting gets used an awful lot. We use that term very much as to describe the result, or basically successful result of an attack. So rather, we wouldn't use the term jackpotting as an actual to describe an attack. We would use that to describe the result of an attack. And as I'm sure many of you who are on the call today are aware, lots of stuff in the news recently about logical attacks which there have been. This is just a few recent headlines which I have pulled from various places to illustrate some of the things which have gone on very recently. And you can see some of these are from very recently. The one from Salina in Kansas from just from April, the one from Tompkins County in New York State, just from March, and the one from Western North Carolina about jackpotting just from earlier this month. So this is very much something which is active, very much something where there are attempts being made and there are attacks happening out there just now. And in a number of instances, there are people being prosecuted and prosecuted successfully, as you can see from the news clipping up in the top left here. So this is very much an active area, very much an ongoing area, as I'm sure many of you are aware. And the fact that this is very much an active and ongoing area is we as NCR Atlas, again, as many of you will be aware, we issue whenever we feel that we see something or we see signs of something that our customers should be aware of, we put out security alerts. We publish those security alerts on our NCR Atlas website, and you can sign up to receive notification of those security alerts through the NCR Atlas website. And you can see here what I've just done is a screen grab of some of the recent ones which we have put out about man-in-the-middle attacks towards the end of last year, and we'll talk a little bit about those malware attacks. We put out an alert on those in March of this year, and I know there's been other alerts put out by other people as well. And even since that alert which we put out in March, it has continued to be very active. And we've also more recently been putting out some alerts on some other items. And we'll get into some of those other different aspects of crime and security in some of the later webinars. One other thing I did want to mention in passing, it's important a lot of the time, we believe, to separate the reality of what is happening out there from scare stories. There's the reality, which is that, yes, there are logical attacks happening, and there are news stories about those logical attacks happening, and indeed other types of attack. But then you also get scare stories driven by, maybe something on the dark web being taken out of context, or somebody trying to exploit the situation by trying to sell something on the dark web which isn't real. And that can often lead to a number of scare stories. And this was one particular example from last year within the European theatre that we saw, where there was one thing on a dark web that got picked up and blown out of lots of proportions. So I put this in just as an example of, there's the reality, and then there's sometimes the scare stories which are put out there, and it's important to distinguish the two items. Now, I said at the beginning of this talk that I wanted to talk a little bit about overall trends. So what I have put on here is a couple of graphs from that we use to represent overall trends. It's important to maybe not get too hung up on the individual statistics here. But what we have definitely seen over the years is we've seen an overall trend, both within the graph on the right, or NCR Atlas custom and engineer data, and the graph on the left. The graph on the right is, so the source of that is EAST. EAST is the European Association for Secure Transactions. Different geography, or more restricted geography, but covering reports from a number of different sources. And the overall trends across the two are very, very, very similar. We've seen back in the 16, 17, 18, 19, a very, very high number of different types of logical attack. But in more recent years, from say 19 onwards, what we've seen is a distinct downturn in the number of logical attacks, and indeed in some of the types of logical attacks as well. And that's pretty much a direct consequence of customers putting appropriate protections in place. And everybody within the industry putting appropriate protections in place. And that has driven down, in many situations, the number of attacks to very low levels if you look at some of the data from East. But if you look at the data on the left-hand side from our NCR Atlas CEA data, you see a small but not insignificant bump up the way in 2025. And I think even just that small bump, even if it's not necessarily completely up-to-date data, reflects what we are seeing. We've definitely seen an uptick in recent months and over the past, let's say 6 to 9 months in terms of the number of attacks out there. And we believe that there are particular reasons behind that, which we'll come on to in a little bit. So overall trend has undoubtedly been down the way, but there's been some more less worrying recent signs in terms of some of the attacks which we have seen out there. And if I come on to talk a little bit about some of the confirmed recent logical attacks which we have seen, we saw a number of instances of what we term man-in-the-middle attacks. And I'll come on to a little bit more of a definition of the different attack types in a few minutes. But we saw a number of those in the second half of 2024, and indeed in the last quarter of 2024, where what was happening, and it was a similar type of profile for most of those attacks, mostly CFIs, mostly drive-up ATMs, mostly situations where there was one or more elements of logical protection lesser lacking. And what we were seeing there, as some of you will have seen in some of the alerts which we put out, ATM top box being opened, an intercept device inserted inside the ATM top box, or indeed device put elsewhere in the ATM, and then the network cable from the ATM plugged into that device, and then that was then used to intercept traffic, authorize transactions, and result in multiple dispenses taking place. So we saw a number of instances of that. We've also seen, particularly during the course of this year, again, as many of you on the call will be aware, we've seen a number of different malware. We've seen a number of instances of malware attacks across multiple geographies within the United States. And in most of those, the modus operandi has been fairly similar in terms of gaining access, basically removing the hard drive, injecting malware onto that hard drive, and then reinserting it and kicking off the malware in order to be able to perform an attack. And most of the attacks, I think pretty much all of the attacks that we've seen of what we would term as offline malware attacks, where the ATM is taken offline, hard disk taken out, and then malware is put onto the hard disk. So offline because the ATM has been taken offline and the hard disk has been put out, rather than online, which is a different type of situation. So we've seen multiple confirmed instances of both of these type of attacks over the last 6 to 9 months. And in all of the instances that we've seen, the mitigation associated with being able to defeat those logical attacks, and I'm deliberately using the term defeat from the point of view of making the attack unsuccessful. Because you can try and stop the attack happening by various means, but what is a lot of it is about is in terms of if an attack happens or if an attempt is made, then the attack isn't successful and there isn't any financial loss. So the mitigation has really been around implementing the recommendations, which many of you will be familiar with and which we've had in place for some time. And there are particular ones in there around TLS encryption and around hard disk encryption, which have particular relevance to the types of attacks which we have seen. But it's important from our perspective to ensure that all of our recommendations are in place in order to ensure appropriate protection. And the reason why it's important to have many of the recommendations in place is to deal with the different types of logical attack which happen and the different types of logical attack which go on out there. I've summarized on this slide, which some of you may have seen variations on, about the list of different types of attack which we have seen. I've talked about offline. I've mentioned offline malware. Offline from the point of view of the ATM is offline. The hard disk has been removed. The ATM has probably been powered down, and the disk is taken out and some kind and basically typically mounted somewhere else and malware injected onto it. So that's what we would consider to be an offline malware attack. Online malware attack where ATM isn't offline. And basically a means is used to load malware onto the ATM whilst it is actually online. I've talked about I've mentioned man-in-the-middle attacks. Man-in-the-middle, as might be, as we've described, is all about tapping into the communications between the ATM and another endpoint, i.e. the transaction authorization switch, or potentially, let's say, another connection, which would allow for some form of jackpotting to be done. And kind of quite similar to that from a network perspective are things like remote software distribution spoofing. Again, tapping into a line which might be getting used to distribute software updates. Maybe that's things like Windows software updates, which get done on a regular basis, or other types of software updates, and pretending to be something which is not in order to be able to download malware, or potentially some form of nefarious remote desktop access. There are good things to use remote desktop access for potentially for doing troubleshooting or some diagnostics, but it's important to have the right protections in place associated with that. And then the last attack vector, which I'll mention, is what we term as black box attacks. And that tends to be all about tapping into the communications line between the PC core and the dispenser. Used to be very prevalent a number of years ago because of protections which have been put in place by ourselves and by others, is really something which has largely in recent years disappeared off the radar because of protections which have been put in place. And that is a part of everything of how things have evolved over the years. What we have seen in recent times is we've tended to see, rather than any major new attack vector coming along, the types of attacks which we have seen in recent times have very been in terms of attack vectors that we've seen before, that we're familiar with. Sometimes it'll be the variations on the theme, if you like, in terms of that particular attack vector. But that's very much what we have seen in recent times. Of course, these things are always evolving. There's always a potential for some different or new type of attack vector to pop up, and that's something which we obviously continually monitor and continually keep an eye on to see if there's anything new which is coming up, and I'll come back to that a little bit later on in the presentation. So, how do you guard against all of these different types of attack? And this is really where many of you will be familiar with our white paper and our recommendations for logical security. I know many of you will have read it. I know many of you will have consumed it. Some of you out there, I may even have spoken to recently or at some of our events and emphasize this. But this is really where we believe the protections are that need to be in place in order to guard against logical attacks. And we're fully aware, that there's other white papers and recommendations out there. I mentioned EAST earlier on, the European organization. They have very, very, very similar recommendations. And I know that others have recommendations out there as well, which are largely similar. Our guidance and our recommendations here has been fairly consistent for quite a number of years. And this is really what we believe everybody should be looking to have in place and should most definitely have in place in order to guard against logical attacks. So I wanted to take a minute or two just to talk through the different items within those recommendations. in no particular order of priority. Firstly, like securing your BIOS, like only allow booting from the hard disk. You can ensure that there's appropriate password protections in place, ensure the secure boot is enabled for for Windows 10 environments. Really, like the basic table stake stuff in terms of ensuring that things are there. Establishing an adequate optimized password policy for all passwords, whether that be the BIOS password on an ATM, whether it be the Windows password on an ATM, whether it be for other systems, really remote desktop access systems. I'm sure everybody is familiar with, and everybody's organisation will likely have policies around how often passwords should be changed, like the strength of password or whatever. We've even published basically an article about the password management, which we can be found on the NCR Atlas website. Ensuring that appropriate comms encryption is in place, absolutely key in terms of ensuring that that is in place. Like the TLS encryption and others. Having a firewall, having appropriate firewall protections in place, like Windows Firewall and others. Again, I'm sure many of you will be familiar with it. Reducing the attack vector, only have there what needs to be there rather than stuff which doesn't need to be there. Have an appropriate anti-malware mechanism in place. Have an appropriate mechanism in place for applying regular patches, keeping software up to date as a part of that, whether it be Windows patches, whether it be patches released by ourselves as NCR Atlas, whether it be patches released even by others as well. Ensuring that the operating system is appropriately configured with minimum privileges, things like the mouse and keyboard, being disabled. Having an appropriate hard disk encryption solution in place, one of the really, really key ones for a lot of levels of protection. In order to guard against, in particular, offline malware attacks. Protected comms to the dispenser, have the appropriate levels of configuration in place there and guidance, which we've had in place for a number of years. And then coming into some other things in terms of pen testing, having an appropriate secure remote software distribution mechanism. Consider the physical environment for different ATMs, different things may be appropriate for different environments. And working within your own organizations to consult with appropriate specialists and ensuring that you have all of the best practice security controls in place within your enterprise. There's a lot more about all of this in our white paper, but this is just intended to be a brief summary of everything which we state and everything which we recommend, which is out there. And we as NCR Atlas have a number of different logical security solutions which are there in order to protect those different levels of vulnerability. And I mentioned some of them on the previous slide about some of the solutions which we have in place. So we have our allow listing solution, previously known as whitelist. It has been called whitelisting before. It has been known as Solidcore. We have our hard disk encryption solutions. We have our encrypted comm solutions. We have our OS hardening solutions. A number of different things which are there. And all of those get incorporated into our service-based offerings as well. From a managed service perspective and from an as a service perspective, we know these things. We have, we have experience in how to deal with all of this. We know how to treat an ATM. Don't consider it to be a laptop or a desktop or whatever. There are particular considerations around 7x24 that come into play when putting some of these protections in place. So we have the experience in terms of being able to do that. And the different solutions which we have in place, target a number of different vectors. As I said, allow listing gives a lot of protection from offline and network malware attacks. Hard disk encryption gives a lot of protection from malware being installed on the hard disk. Comms encryption prevents man-in-the-middle attacks, which can lead to changes in transactions or authorization of transactions when they shouldn't be done. Remote BIOS update solutions like allow you to configure the BIOS and ensure that BIOS is kept up to date and protect against booting from external media. And then we move into some of our other solutions and into some of our newer solutions, like our security management solution, to prevent unauthorized access to BIOS and Windows settings, and gives extensive password management capabilities and indeed broader security posture information. And again, you like as well as having these as license offerings, then we bring them together into a lot of our service offerings as well. And all of the different solutions which I've talked about here, if we think back to the different types of attack that I was mentioning earlier on, you can start to overlay the different things onto the different types of attacks. Hard disk encryption onto offline malware, as we've talked about, allow listening onto basically online malware, secure software distribution into software distribution spoofing, encrypted comms into man-in-the-middle attacks. You can see the direct relationships with our security solution and our security service mitigations against the different types of attack vector, which we have seen over the years. And indeed, we have different ways to utilize our solution portfolio in order to guard against all of the different ways, from the software subscription mechanism about buying it and running it in-house, through our different service offerings around managed services where you subscribe to the service and we run the solutions, or even into the as a service where you would subscribe to as a service and NCR Atlays runs the entire ATM operations, including all of the security and including basically ensuring that all of the right protections are in place. So I mentioned this from the point of view it is massively important to have all of the right solutions in place and satisfy yourself that all of those solutions in place. And then there's different operational models which will be appropriate for different people in relation to having those solutions in place, and in relation to being able to take advantage of the offerings which we as NCR Atlays have and which we can put in place, particularly with our security services, with our investment in all of the things that I've mentioned about, and in all of those industry-leading platforms to enable a standard and simple security suite of services to cover all of the things such as the day zero protection, password compliance, the ensuring protection about the data being at rest. And we look upon this as very much as it should never be considered as a pick and mix. It should be, whether it be the 15 rules, whether it be security services, whether it be everything that I'm talking about, it's a layered approach. It's a checklist type of approach to ensure that you have all of the right protections in place, to ensure that you are appropriately protected, and satisfying yourself that you have all of the right protections in place. Even in recent weeks and in recent months, we have continued to see some successful attacks, and almost invariably, there'll be something in relation to the protections that are missing, which comes into those different types of attack. So, as we have, and within NCR Atlays, as we've been talking about, our whole portfolio looks to defend the ATM in a number of different ways. I've obviously been concentrating on logical security, and everything which goes around there. Like others in the webinar series, we'll talk about other mechanisms and other routes and about other protections which are in place. So we view it as very much as we protect through having the appropriate solutions in place, whether it be for logical or whether it be physical. We look to detect, again, through solutions in place to detect where there might be, detecting crime, through some of the things that we have in relation to skimming, or even in relation to some of the things which we have as far as allow listening about detecting and blocking something attempting to run. And we now move forward from into like increasingly we will look forward as a managing as well, and managing of the defence of the ATM through a number of the different portals and a number of the other newer solutions which we're starting to work through. And we wanted to take a few minutes today as a part of this webinar just to give you an idea of some of the newer things that we're working on with our security management solution, which brings in capabilities around checking ATM security posture, managing passwords, giving a view of security compliance concerns, and a way to be able to drill down and deal with some of those concerns. But rather than getting into a lot of detail from a PowerPoint perspective, we just wanted to take about 3-4 minutes during the course of this webinar to just give you a little bit of a view and a little bit of a demonstration of the security management solution, which we're working on just now and in some of the early stages of deployment, just to give you a little bit of a glimpse into the future. So I will stop talking for a few minutes, and I will hand over to one of my colleagues, Aldrin Barreto, who will just take 3 or 4 minutes to take you through some of the things around our security management solution. So Aldrin, over to yourself.
Thank you, Derek. Is my screen visible?
Yes, it is.
Okay, excellent. So as soon as you log into security management, you'll see the new dashboard that is designed to provide key information into the security of your ATM fleet. More specifically, the potential concerns affecting the ATMs. So for example, on the top left, you can see the number of ATMs that have security concerns out of the total number of ATMs registered in the system. You can see the ongoing statistics of jobs. Jobs are essentially actions to change something on the ATM. For example, it could be to change the Windows admin password, it could be to update the BIOS to the latest version, or it could be to change a firewall rule, so on and so forth. And on the right-hand side, you can see the details of the potential security concerns that are conveniently categorized. And these concerns are roughly based on the rules and recommendations outlined in our logical security white paper. And last not least, the chart on the left shows a graphical representation of the concerns on the right, and you can drill down to see the details. You can also export all this information for additional analysis or for showing that data in an external solution. So for example, there's an ATM where the BIOS admin password hasn't been changed for more than 90 days. NCR Atleast recommends that passwords are changed every 90 days. And within security management, you can easily resolve this concern. So for example, if I click on the one terminal, I can see the terminal affected. All I have to do is select that terminal, change the password, and I can change the password now or at a later date or time. Even better, within security management, you can set up a recurring schedule to change the password every 90 days or every 40 days, or to match your password policies. And while we're in the BIOS management area, you also have the ability to update the BIOS to the latest version, or to change the boot order, so to temporarily boot from a USB flash drive instead of the hard disk to perform maintenance. And you can also change some other BIOS parameters as well. Coming back to the dashboard, just like BIOS passwords, you can also view, change, or share Windows passwords. And we take password security very seriously. So just like BIOS passwords, if Windows passwords are viewed or shared, the password will automatically be changed after a configurable period of time. And on top of that, the passwords are stored in an encrypted state and transmitted to the ATMs in an encrypted state. You can also see the state of a love listing previously called Solid Core. And you will also have the ability to manage the state through single sign-on to an EPO server. Additionally, the same applies to the hard disk. You can see the encryption state of the hard disk drives, and we're also adding the ability to manage the encryption state through single sign-on into the HDE server. And what I'm showing you is just scratching the surface as to what you can do with security management. And we're constantly working with customers to add new features and functionality. But the takeaway here is that there's a new system that allows you to remotely manage the security of your ATM estate easily and conveniently from a centralized portal. It helps you apply a lot of the rules and recommendations outlined in our logical security white paper. So
Thank you,
that's it from
Alden.
me. Over to you, Derek.
Yep, thank you, Alden. Appreciate that. So we wanted to include that just to give you a little bit of a flavour of some of the way in which some of our thoughts are going forward, and the way in which we're taking basically some of our things on a go forward type of basis. So let me just take a few minutes to round things off in some of the different things. So we've talked a lot about the protections to be put in place, the importance of having all of the protections in place, not treating things as a pick and mix, treating things from the point of view as a checklist, less of having everything there, like the different options which are available, so from our basically from our services perspective, as far as NCR is concerned. And it's important to continue to stay protected. I mean, as you know, new things, the potential for something to come along or for a different variation or whatever to come along, unless it exists all of the time. We see things like, like the FBI warning of new ATM scams, just from a story from last month. Now, I come back to one of the points I said earlier on in terms of is it genuinely new? We see a lot of variations in a theme rather than necessarily new things. But then we also see things like Fraud GPT. Yep, everybody's great at using ChatGPT and Copilot and other similar things. Criminals are starting to evolve with some of these things as well. We see other things happening in other types of spaces too. So it becomes increasingly important to have all of the protections in place and to ensure that all of those are in place, because we continue to see that where those are deployed, it guards against attacks coming along, and even a lot of the new variations on a theme which we see, where the base level of protection that needs to be applied is very similar to, is effectively the same as what is likely to be out there. Just to give an idea as to how things are moving, this is a chart from the US National Vulnerability Database. Any of you can go and look at the statistics in here, and they keep a track of list of vulnerabilities reported. Now this is vulnerabilities across all software environments. This is not just ATM specific. Don't get worried about that. This is across all environments. Now, my point in showing this is if you look across all of the environments and you look at the vulnerabilities being reported, you can see how things are almost in recent years heading into almost a kind of like an exponential situation from 22 to 23 to 24. And there's a number of different factors in that. Things like enhanced awareness of a lot of things in recent years is leading to a higher level of reporting. Everybody's becoming more aware. Everybody's thinking about doing pen tests. Everybody's thinking about everything which is going on. Increase in overall potential surface area for attack. Systems become more complex, more extensive. Increase in systems interconnectivity, opening up new potential attack points. Increasing criminal sophistication, the level of knowledge which is being deployed, the level of sophistication of attacks. And the level of sophistication of attacks is in many ways driven by the fact that a lot of the potential attack vectors that might have been there are being blocked off, so they have to become increasingly sophisticated at how things are being done. And new solutions are obviously coming along at a faster rate. So there's many different factors in that, increase. Play that back into the ATM environment and into the environment in which we know and love. It just emphasizes the importance of having all of those protections in place and having the full suite of protections in place, to guard against the increasingly sophisticated attack types or increasing numbers of attempts to get around all of the protections which are in place there just now. And it potentially becomes an ever-evolving situation. And this is where we as an organisation and we as a company, we continue to monitor everything which is going on. We continue to keep an eye on what's happening out there. We know that we need to be hyper vigilant. We ensure that the protection's in place. It's able to build a bigger wall. Criminals will get a bigger ladder, which means that we need to look to see whether or not there's anything that we need to do with the wall which we built. So, but that's one of the things which we're all about. We have people, we have processes in place within NCR Atlas, as others will do, in relation to monitoring everything which is going on, to ensure that we continue to alert customers where appropriate, to continue to ensure that we have the the capabilities and the solutions in place to allow for the monitoring to be done, whether it be in the logical space or whether it will be, as we talk about in future webinars, in other spaces as well. So let me finish for a couple of minutes on just like a call to action, and then we have some time left over for any questions that anybody might want to put into the chat. Many of you out there will be familiar with the NCR Atlas Security White Paper. If you're not, or if you haven't reviewed it recently, we would encourage you to do so. It's on the NCR Atlas website. You can get it up there. If you're having difficulty finding it, get in touch with your NCR Atlas rep. They'll help you to find it. And basically review it and use that as satisfy yourself that you're appropriately protected. Work with ourselves to basically to ensure that you have all of the mitigations in place, not just some, all. And as a part of that, consider migration to NCR Atlas Server Solutions. We do this stuff for a number of customers. We know how to do it. There's a consideration to be had there as well. So review the white paper, review the protections that you have, satisfy yourself that you're appropriately protected, satisfy yourself that you have all of the appropriate mitigations in place, and that you have all of the mitigations appropriately configured as well, which applies to some of them. I'm thinking particularly here of TLS encryption. It's not just about having TLS encryption in place, it's about ensuring that it is appropriately configured too. And sign up for NCR Atlas security alerts. If something happens out there which we believe that our customer base should know about or should be told about, we'll publish an alert and we'll identify whatever might need to be taken as a part of that. So with that, I want to thank everyone for taking the time today. Time is a very valuable commodity for everybody I know. I want to thank everybody for taking the time today to listen in. It's been a genuine pleasure to be able to talk to everybody and to take a little bit of time in everybody's day. And we have a little bit of time left over. If there's any questions that anybody has, then we can start to address them in the chat.
Thank you, Derek. Just a couple of points, actually. There's a couple of people have asked about access to the slides. I just wanted to make everyone aware we will be sharing the slides via your account executives, so they will actually make the slides available to you. And as for the Logical Security White Paper, there's been a request for that as well. We will do the same. We will make sure your account executives have the latest version, but actually it's on our website as well, so you can access it from there. I just wanted to point that out because there have been a couple of questions around that. The other questions that I have, Derek, it's actually come in separately. Which of the 15 rules would you consider to be the most important? It's like picking your most favourite kid, right? It's a good question.
Yeah, I mean, like, I couldn't possibly choose who my most favourite child is. I think that's an interesting one, and one which gets asked, quite frequently. And the answer to it is there isn't any individual one which I would really want to call out above the others. Yeah, it's all about ensuring that you have all of the protections in place. Where we've seen successful attacks has almost, Liz, there's genuinely been something missing. Like solution A might be in place, but solution B is not in place, and that leaves open a gap. So I wouldn't point to any particular of the 15 rules and say that's the most important, or that's more important than the others. It's about ensuring that you have all of the appropriate protections in place and satisfying yourself that you have all of the appropriate protections in place. So that's what I would say in relation to that particular one.
Excellent. What about any new vectors? Have we seen any new vectors, attack vectors recently?
What we've seen in recent times is we've seen a lot of the, Liz, I think it's fair to say that the attacks that we've seen recently have really fallen into, like the different categories that we talked about there in terms of less online and offline and so on. Yes, there might have been, maybe less of variations within that particular area, but we haven't seen any significant new attack vectors. And by the same token, the advice in terms of the protections that we believe should be in place, has been pretty consistent for a while now in terms of what we believe people should have in place from a protection perspective.
Yeah. Okay. And lastly, can you just quickly share, so we'll obviously make this available through the account teams as well, but how do people sign up for the security alerts?
So you can sign up through the security alerts by going to the NCR Atlaze website. If you go to the homepage of the NCR Atlaze website, and basically you go to, I think it's security is the top level option.
Yeah.
Then that will allow you, then basically that will take you down through there to where you can view the alert archive, and where you can sign up for any new alerts which we issue.
And we would absolutely encourage everyone to do that.
Yes, absolutely. Yep.
So there's no more questions from here. So I just want to take the time to thank everyone. As you've already said, I just want to echo your point. Thank you everyone for joining. We do have a second webinar in 2 weeks' time on the 10th of June. I'd love it if you could all register for that when the email comes out. And Charlie Harrow is going to be talking about card skimming and cash trapping. So I do encourage you to join. That will be the second in the series in 2 weeks' time. So without anything else to say, thank you so much, everyone.